When you talk about Wells, this is an enormously prolific writer. He just didn't stop. All his great sci-fi novels were written within a 10-year span. War of the Worlds is 1898, and by 1905, that's The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Time Machine. These cluster of books, they're so well written to a real poetic command of language.
H.G. Wells was born in Bromley in Kent in 1866 into a small shopkeeping family. He would consider himself lower middle class, but was poorer than the working class people around him. Being in a family that struggled to make ends meet had a real profound effect on his career later on.
Wells was an interesting character. He was a little man who spoke in a high Cockney voice, and his parents were former domestic servants, and they kept a china shop, and he was apprenticed in the china shop. And I guess he discovered reading when he broke his leg somehow. He was a frail kid. I think he also had tuberculosis.
People found Wells a charming man. He was always the highlight of a dinner table, and he was just full of ideas and always enthusing people to think for themselves and to be creative with their ideas. As a public speaker, on the other hand, he was seen as very ineffectual, quite ironic. When he was in front of a podium and speaking to an audience, he had a high, squeaky, bird-like voice, and he always talked into his moustache.
In 1938, he lectured at the Wilshire E-Bell Club. I thought I must pay very close attention to how he speaks. So as best I can, I could now repeat for you his opening remarks. He said, "I am going to talk to you for about an hour. Today, east is west, and west is east, and they are coming together with a bang." And he was quite prophetic. We are off to our war with Japan.
Throughout the world, a process of financial and economic collapse is in progress. If it continues, it means the end of civilization as we have known it. Already it has produced incalculable suffering and misery for scores of millions of human beings. And yet it is not a hopeless situation.
In the late 19th century, the genre of science fiction was coming into being. Jules Verne had been writing for many years and wasn't particularly popular in English until around the late 19th century, when H.G. Wells was emerging as a science fiction writer. They're often paired together as the kind of co-founders of science fiction as a genre.
Verne and Wells had this rivalry, and Verne held H.G. Wells in a kind of contempt because Wells didn't do the science. When Jules Verne shot a man to the moon, he did all the research and all the math, and they figured out that there would have to be a rocket, and the rocket would have to go from Cape Canaveral, or it would have to go from Texas, either way, and he figured out, and then it would end up in the ocean, and there would be a rescue at sea, and he got the whole thing perfect. And H.G. Wells just invented a substance that cut off all gravity and called it cavorite, you know, and Jules Verne said, where's the science in that? That's just... You know, that's fiction, but it isn't science fiction.
The purpose of Wells sending a man to the moon was to explore a kind of different civilization that existed on the moon, whereas Verne was simply interested in the ability to send people to the moon and back as an end in itself. So their approaches to science fiction were entirely different.
What really distinguishes Wells, I think, as a writer of science fiction is that he's a very good writer. He's a real prose stylist.
Wells' reputation as a prophet is founded right from the beginning of his career on his scientific imagination. In the War of the Worlds, for example, he predicts the use of laser beams, the heat ray, as it's referred to in the War of the Worlds. So Wells was full of ideas for modern technology.
He wasn't scientifically, if he didn't do the actual research, he did apply what somebody has called a kind of remorseless logic to his vision of future events.
In other works, such as The Time Machine, he's talking about something that Einstein would later make more scientifically plausible, the idea of time as a fourth dimension. Not scientifically plausible in the Einsteinian sense, but Wells was groping towards the kind of ideas that Einstein would later make his own and elaborate in much more detail. He felt that technology could provide the means for people to access pretty well all the knowledge that was available to the human race. His ideas for achieving this were the creation of what he called the world brain, and this was a system of microphotography on projection machines, and it would circulate all the printed material, all the photographic material, for people to use as resources and to study. In many ways, the world brain is a forerunner of what we now call the World Wide Web. Wells, I think, would have been very pleased to have seen the development of this kind of technology, and may have also claimed credit for its development with his world brain ideas.
They did predict many things that came to pass. Verne predicted that moonshot. I mean, down to the last bootlace, he predicted it. Wells was also a very early and enthusiastic champion of women's lib. Women getting the vote, women's education, women being equal to men in terms of opportunity and pay scale and stuff. He was on the barricades in the forefront of that movement.
Wells made many contributions to the world in which we live today. Probably the most primary would be his fathering of science fiction as a literary genre. On another level, Wells's advocacy of international relations and cooperation. He interviewed world leaders such as Lenin, Stalin, Roosevelt, both Roosevelts, was friends with Winston Churchill. In 1914, he wrote about a League of Peace, what later became, in Woodrow Wilson's terminology, a League of Nations. He spent 1917 and 1918 primarily lobbying the governments of Britain and France to accept the League of Nations as a war aim for the conclusion of the war. In 1930s, Wells was the international president of PEN, the Poets, Essayists and Novelists lobby group, which basically campaigned for free speech around the world. And part of his trip to the Soviet Union in 1934 was to try and introduce a PEN club into Russia, a club that would respect opposition opinion. Stalin advised Wells to go and speak to the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, who was a very close friend of Stalin's. Gorky saw that the Soviet Union was too vulnerable to allow oppositional opinion at that time in its history, and Wells left Russia a very disappointed man. In 1933, the Nazis in Germany drafted up a list of authors who were on the proscribed reading list in Germany, and this resulted in 1934 in the burning of books. Wells was one of those authors. His books were publicly burnt in the main square in Berlin. The Nazis' position against Wells actually went so far as for him to be included on the German wanted list of British intellectuals in the event of a German invasion of Britain. This was published after the war. It is unknown whether Wells was aware of his appearance on this list.
I remember in 1953, I was privileged to be at Paramount Studios and see the first showing of George Pal's War of the Worlds. I recall sending him a telegram saying I didn't dare breathe for 90 minutes.
What's interesting about the movie War of the Worlds is what a product of the Eisenhower 50s that movie is. The Cold War and the McCarthy witch hunts played an enormous background role. It just permeated your thinking. Paranoia. Are the aliens in George Pal's Eastern European mind some version of the communists? The thing you need most is an ending, and that's what this novel has, the bacteria. You know, oh God, that's what brought him down, germs. They didn't have Listerine. That's brilliant.